Welcome back. Now, what I have planned for you today is a little bit different from some of the content and the material that we've done together before. And that's because I picked up something for myself, a little treat, a little update, I guess you could say, to some of the accessories that I have laying around my house. And that is that I picked up a copy of the Game of Thrones tarot deck. Now, this deck intrigued me because I am a fan of Game of Thrones. Huge fan, honestly. A bit, not obsessive, but pretty close. I'm a big fan of Game of Thrones. Anything kind of medieval, high fantasy, otherworldly, I really enjoy. So Game of Thrones is definitely one of my favorites. But I also have had this fascination with tarot and divination tools for several decades, probably for as long as I can remember. So what I wanted to do was unbox it with you, show you the artwork on the cards. It is magnificent. And just do a little bit of a chat here and there so you can also gain some lore and background into this incredibly enigmatic sort of hobby or interest, the tarot. Now, I am by no means an expert in the tarot. I am only familiar with the basics, and there's a reason for that, and I wanted to share that story with you. So I've been very much interested in the mysterious and the sort of shadowy aspects of life for as long as I can remember. I remember lots of little girls around me wanting to be, princesses and fairies and ballerinas, and I just wanted to be a vampire spy. So I've always been kind of into the mysterious, somewhat occult side of human nature, I suppose you could say. So I don't think it was really a surprise to my parents that I became interested in spooky things, and including the tarot, very early in life. And I remember seeing a scene in a movie, a wonderful movie called The Red Violin, where there's a fortune teller. I presume she was probably Roma or Gypsy from that tradition, and she was reading the tarot for this woman named Anna, and she kind of foresaw and foretold of a very traumatic event that would change the course of the life of her as well as her husband. And that really intrigued me at that point when I saw her reading the tarot. And I kind of took it upon myself to pick up a deck. I just got one from the local bookstore. I think it was a Kohl's or a Chapters, and I just went in and picked up the cheapest deck that I could and tried to learn the cards, and it was a massive failure. massive failure, honestly. There are 78 cards in a deck of tarot cards, a normal, regular, traditional deck. 78 cards. And I was attempting to memorize each and every one of those cards. And I very quickly gave them up and threw the card deck in the garbage. In theory, a reader should be able to look at the artwork present on any of the cards and sort of interpret what the meaning of that card might be based on the artwork, and then how that artwork corresponds with the artwork of the other cards in the reading, and whether it's upright or upside down or reversed, as we call it. And even still, with this Rider-Waite deck, it just doesn't click for me at all. So when I saw that there was a Game of Thrones tarot, I wondered if perhaps the artwork could speak to me on a different level, that maybe the artwork was detailed and accurate enough that from looking at the picture on the front of the card, we might not have to memorize the meaning of the card, but maybe we could infer the meaning of the card based purely off the fact that I've seen the television show and I know the characters very well. So this is the boxed Game of Thrones tarot deck. It comes in this beautiful box with this lovely sort of copper gilded scroll work around the sides, all the way around. And it says Game of Thrones Tarot Deck and Guidebook. Now here on the front of the box are 3 different examples of cards and their artwork that are found inside of this deck. So we have the Hermit, which is one of the major arcana, and it appears to be Bran Stark. We have the Queen of Swords, one of the minor arcana, and it is Queen Cersei sitting on the Iron Throne. And then we have the Empress, which is another of the major arcana, and it is Daenerys Targaryen, I believe, right around the time that she was claiming Meereen, when she became the Queen of Meereen, I think. So down here as well, next to the word tarot, and also along the side, the different insignias, the symbols for each of the houses are found here. So there's the Targaryen dragon here. I know it's difficult, you maybe can't see it. We have the Lannister lion, and we have the Stark direwolf, maybe the Tyrell. I think that's their little flower insignia there. So and so then on the other side, this says explore Game of Thrones with this beautifully rendered and wholly original tarot card deck. Includes 78 card deck and a hardcover guidebook. And then we have 5 more examples of cards found within this deck. So we have the Star, which I believe is Sansa Stark, when she is looking through the window with the candle, trying to get help to escape from Ramsay Bolton. We have the Hanged Man here, which is one of the flayed individuals. Then we have the Page of Swords, which appears to be one of the assassins. I don't remember what that group of assassins is called. Then we have Judgment, which is the Night King himself. And we have the Magician, Peter Baelish, or Littlefinger, the nasty little fella he is. He's right there. So this box did come wrapped in plastic. It was very loud plastic. I was going to include it as a crinkle, but it was very loud. So we're going to avoid that. So the box opens with a hinged top, and then on the inside we have our deck of cards and our guidebook here, which is a lovely hardcover guidebook. There's a little yellow ribbon in each of the 2 compartments to help you pull that piece out as well. Now the cards did also come wrapped in that very loud, thick plastic, so I also unwrapped those just to make this a little easier and quieter. So let's take a look at the guidebook. So this is the guidebook. It's very tiny, so it does have the meanings of each of the cards, little keywords that will help you if you are unfamiliar with the cards or you're just learning. So it will give a brief description of the character as well as the meaning of the cards, ideally. We'll have a look in a sec. So there's this lovely sort of scrolled pattern on the inside here in black, and that is also on the back. And it's textured as well. Very lightly textured. So it has inside, it says Game of Thrones Tarot Guidebook. So it has some pretty normal things in here, things like an introduction, of course, and preparing for a reading, how to prepare your space, get yourself ready to read the cards. It has a little bit about the illustrator as well. And then the cards' meanings here. So it goes through the major and minor arcanas and the suit of swords, cups, spears, and coins, which are the 4 minor arcana houses in this particular deck, and those will change sometimes. You'll see it as staffs instead of spears, or you might see sticks. Sometimes it's pentacles instead of coins. So there are different ways to name each of the different houses, but they will all correspond with a particular thing. So then something very interesting here is some new layouts. So we'll take a look at those. Now remember that there's no right or wrong way to lay out your cards, because they aren't telling the future. They are giving you insight. So you can feel free to invent your own layouts with your own deck that best suits your needs and piques your imagination. And it appears that that is what the authors of this guidebook have done. So they've given some kind of Game of Thrones themed layouts for us to use. So I want to have a look at those, but first let's just have a peek at the introduction. Created in 15th century Italy, the tarot was first used to play card games and commemorate royal occasions. By the late 18th century, however, the cards had become a tool for divination. Today, tarot continues to illuminate our past, present, and future with its enduring popularity due to the cards' imagery of archetypes. All of the many decks and many diverse representations of the cards tap into the realm of universal archetypes, from the priestess to the hero, the mother to the hermit. Archetypes are the foundation of every great tale, and Game of Thrones is an outstanding story, a rich weave. Mythically proportioned, Game of Thrones boasts more than 60 hours of masterful visual storytelling. Can't argue with that. From the icy landscapes beyond the wall to the hot deserts of Dorne, the world of Game of Thrones is replete with symbolism, an abundant source for a new tarot deck. The creative team behind this deck dug deep into these two worlds to find the overlapping characters, story arcs, and symbolism. We intertwined them into a unique tarot that evokes the vivid dramas of Game of Thrones while offering rich, oracular cues for the serious tarot reader. By bringing this epic saga into our hand-drawn cards, we have created a deck that honors the tradition of tarot and our favorite television drama. Cool. So it goes into shuffling and choosing your cards, how to clear them if you choose to do so. Just essentially how to take you from opening the box all the way up to performing your first reading. And that's all here. So we have the kind of generic past, present, future layout. For instant insight into any situation, most guidebooks will contain a 3-card spread just like this. Only in this case, they don't call it past, present, future. They call it Dragon Glass, Milk of the Poppy, and Valyrian Steel. Love it. Okay, so we have a layout called the Red Keep. This is a 4-card layout. The Red Keep, seat of the ruler of the 7 kingdoms, is the powerhouse of political intrigue. True. The card positions align with 3 areas of the keep, helping you see the opportunities available to you. So, card number 1 is the Throne Room, what's powerful in your life right now. The Tower of the Hand, what needs to get organized. The Secret Tunnels, what is the hidden advantage in this situation. And then number 4 is the outcome if you continue on the path that you are on currently. Then we have the Old Gods of the North layout. This one here. So it's 5 cards arranged in the shape of a maple leaf. The old gods were worshipped for thousands of years. These are the gods who are worshipped at large weirwood trees decorated with carved faces. Interesting. We have a Faith of the 7 layout as well. A 7-pointed star with 7 cards to read. Just a little bit more insight into the situation. Every time you add a card, of course, you kind of get a little bit more detail into your reading. Father, smith, warrior, mother, maiden, crone, and stranger. The 7 aspects of God according to the faith of the 7. Oh, they did this. Okay. So now we have the spread called I Drink and I Know Things. Tyrion Lannister, with his armory of quotations, is certainly worth a tarot spread of his own. I agree. Very interesting. I might try this one someday soon. Then we have Spread of the Maesters. Here, very detailed spread. Looks like a 10-card spread with 10 different subjects, similar to how if you were going to the Citadel to be a maester, and you would be required to have knowledge in those 10 areas of astronomy, construction, history, ravenry, economics, smithing, healing, warcraft, magic, and astrology. So there's a card associated with each of those 10 subjects, and maybe some of the topics or related things that you might find in conjunction with those things. For example, your Ravenry card might be about communication or travel. Interesting. And then it gets into the meanings of the cards, starting with the Major Arcana. So rather than continue to go through this book, I really want to show you some of the artwork that is present on these cards. If you are a Game of Thrones fan, or you appreciate good artwork, you need to see these cards. They're wonderful. So, this is a full 78 card deck. And the back of every single card is like a little close-up of the Iron Throne and all of the swords that are kind of welded and melded together on that throne. It's kind of interesting. There's different symbols on the handles of each of the swords. Some are probably family crests, maybe, although I can't really recognize any of them, but that's probably what they are. So this is a very nice sized deck. My regular deck is a significant amount smaller, but to be honest, most decks are on the larger side, so this one's nice. There's a little bit of texture on the cards as well. It reminds me of the little raised bumps on the ends of a zip tie. When you close the zip tie and it goes bump, 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 bump. It's very similar. So, this is the first card in the deck, although technically it is numbered as card 0. So there are 22 cards of the major arcana, but we technically number them 0 through to 21. And the first card that is always 0 is known as the Fool. This particular image is of Tyrion Lannister. He has a torch, and I believe he is trying to feed the dragons that are mothered by Daenerys when he goes down into the den to attempt to befriend the dragons. I believe this is from that scene. Now, the Fool doesn't necessarily represent foolishness, as we might think. I think we can all agree that Tyrion Lannister is a little bit immature, but he's not really a fool. And that is kind of the interpretation that most people will find in the card, the Fool, is a certain amount of spontaneity and resourcefulness without thinking, not necessarily having to calculate and account for things. For example, someone who has a lot of money and doesn't budget simply because they don't have to. So if we come across this card in an upright position, it can often mean some aspect of spontaneity, knowledge and spontaneity. If this card were reversed, we might possibly interpret that as taking risks, uncalculated risks. So the Fool is someone that follows their heart without calculating, who takes great risks, not necessarily that end in anything negative. Taking risks can be a good thing, and that's the Fool. And I think they've chosen a very good image to represent this card. Now, card 1, card 2, the second card that is card 1 is the Magician. And I'm sure if you are familiar with Peter Baelish, then you know exactly what the Magician card represents. This is somebody who's very smart, very skilled, very resourceful, and very sly. This is somebody who often thinks about themselves, but appears to think about everyone else. In an upright position, in terms of a positive interpretation, we can look at things like resourcefulness and creation and manifesting abundance, and sort of, it's a very actioned person, somebody who takes a lot of steps towards becoming successful. And then if that card is reversed, we're talking about manipulation, taking action without forethought, not calculating risks. This is somebody, when upside down or reversed, that is sly and secretive and may not come out on top. Put it that way. Peter Baelish. So, card number 2 or 3, depending on which way you're counting, is the Priestess or High Priestess, depending on what deck you have. And here they've chosen Melisandre, the Red Woman, to be the image found on this card, which is very appropriate. So the Priestess is an archetype kind of known for secrets and sacredness and some qualities of the mother or the crone, maturity. Somebody who brings a lot of maybe spiritual or not arcane, but sort of a unique, maybe spiritual stance on life. So this person is often nurturing, they're often very knowledgeable and very helpful, and yet when reversed and upside down, it can often indicate someone being miseducated or staying silent and not standing up for what they believe to be right or standing up for the wrong things. And that is the Priestess. And they've picked an excellent image for this that they've painted, because the look on the Red Woman's face almost looks to be uncertain. And that's very much what this card ends up being about. And in stark contrast, we have the Empress as our next card in the Major Arcana. And this is the card here that we saw on the front of the box that this deck came in. And this is an image of Daenerys Targaryen coming into, I believe, Meereen on her ship, or one of her ships. Now the Empress is a much more family-oriented archetype. This is somebody who is nurturing, family-focused. It can indicate some dependence on others, possibly, but not always. This card also speaks of femininity and of beauty and attractiveness. But if we find this card reversed or upside down, it may indicate that this person is unable to take action without the help of others. Or maybe they are afraid to sort of take initiative for themselves and they need to have somebody else help them. A type of dependence, I guess you could say. And that can sometimes be indicated when this card is upside down. So in contrast to the Empress, we have the Emperor, which in this case is Jon Snow, all decked out in his stark armor, his leather armor. And he's got his sword there, and I would say that it is winter. Winter has already come. Now the Emperor is exactly what you would expect from Jon Snow, who is very dedicated to the things that he has devoted his life to, and has some authority, but oftentimes follows his heart when he should be following his brain. So, while this card isn't necessarily about authority, it can kind of indicate sometimes a certain amount of stubbornness, resistance to change, and dedication to something larger than himself. And that is the Emperor. Now our next card, the Hierophant, is Varys, Lord Varys. Lord? I think he's a Lord. Lord Varys, one of the advisors in the Lannister court, or I should say in the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms court. And again, this card was just wonderfully chosen for the archetype. Varys represents this card so well. So when upright, this card represents spirituality, tolerance, and a desire to do what's best for everyone. So kind of being dedicated to one purpose and being absolutely steadfast in that purpose. Somebody who is not selfish, but wants to move towards the greater good. And I believe Varys said at one point that he does what is best for the Empire. And that is exactly what this card represents. Now when reversed, though, this card can represent some sort of selfishness, uncertainty, and inability to see what lies beyond that next move that you've made for yourself. That would be this card. Very interesting. I've always liked his robes. Oh, and in the background, hopefully you can see on the camera, all in the background here in the light and dark blue is a whole bunch of birds. And he has his little birds that go around and spy and do espionage tasks for him so that he can do the greater good for the Empire. Interesting. The Lovers is our next card. In this particular rendition of this card, we have Jon Snow and Ygritte, the wildlings, in Jon's wildling face. And again, this is just the perfect rendition of this card and its meanings. You have two people who have supposedly united towards a particular purpose, and that's great and all, but sometimes love can distract us. So this card can indicate some sort of alignment, and two people or two things, two situations having parallel values, but can also indicate that maybe we're getting a little off track, a little distracted. Priorities aren't in the right spot. And in particular, when this is reversed, we might start to notice some selfishness, either on behalf of one partner or one side, or both of them are paying too much attention to the relationship and not enough to the other aspects of their life. And this is a perfect example of that. Of Ygritte having a relationship with somebody who's not a wildling, and of Jon Snow not remembering his oath to the Brotherhood, the men of the Night's Watch. I love it. I love it. Our next one is the Chariot. Now, at first I couldn't really figure out what this was, the artwork on this card. It's very good, but I couldn't tell who the people were. And then I realized that this is one of Daenerys' dragons, kind of howling and roaring in front of a horde of Dothraki people, I believe. This fellow here has very long hair in a braid, so I think it's Dothraki. And Oh, it is, actually. I just noticed their little arced weapons there, the little sickles that they carry. I just noticed those. Wasn't looking close enough, was I? So, the chariot is, of course, traditionally a vehicle used during war, any sort of conflict, and this card can definitely indicate conflict, willpower, and action, taking action steps towards your goal. It can indicate some amount of aggression as well. Now, as we move into the reversed meaning of this card, it can sort of indicate a lack of direction, passion and aggression with a lack of direction, and maybe on the other side of the coin, maybe holding yourself back and not pursuing what you believe you should be pursuing with your passion. And that is the Chariot. And of course, the Dothraki and dragons too, I suppose, portray that very accurately. They are a group of people who are very aggressive and action-oriented, but when faced with a lack of direction, that progress will scatter. It will just sort of dissipate and nobody really gets anywhere and nothing really gets done. So that's the Chariot. So our next card, card number 8, is Strength. And this is represented by Brienne of Tarth, the Knight. Also very appropriate. This particular card, you can kind of tell from the name of the card, Strength, that this card represents courage, emotion that can be translated into something very physical. We're talking about steadfastness, dedication, and action, pushing forward despite the odds. That is what this card is about, and that's just perfect. Brienne of Tarth is the perfect face for this card. I think it's fantastic. And you can kind of see her face is almost in a bit of a frown, as if she's kind of, thinking about her next move, wanting to move forward. Now, when reversed, though, we can start to look at maybe a lack of discipline. We can start to look at maybe there are too many negative emotions that do not lead to action, or emotions that are impeding action forward. The opposite of courage. We might even start to move into the topic of fear. Those are some things that might come up with the Strength card. Brienne of Tarth. I love this artwork, but her hand looks enormous on this card. It looks enormous. Now we saw this card again on the front of the box that the set came in. This is the Hermit, and this is Bran Stark with a raven, and it appears to be the three-eyed raven. Appears to be. It's hard to tell. So, of course, the three-eyed raven has a third eye that has sort of a psychic ability to see past events and parallel events and how events may play out. And Bran sort of adapts and adopts this characteristic throughout his soul searching. So this is a very appropriate image to put on this card. We're talking about someone here who is soul searching, looking for purpose. There's somebody that has been spending a lot of time in isolation, away from social situations and away from socializing with other people, who's very much an introvert. Spends a lot of their time in introspection and retrospection, looking inside of themselves and looking into the past to see what lessons can be learned. And that's kind of the job of the Hermit, is to avoid social distractions, to gain knowledge and wisdom. But, of course, if we've seen this particular season of Game of Thrones, we know that things start to go awry as well. And so when this card is reversed, we might be looking at somebody who has not only distanced themselves from social situations, but may have caused some amount of estrangement where people just don't want to come near them anymore either. So that can be a meaning of this card if it's reversed. We may also be looking at someone who's very lonely and who doesn't really know how to form interactions and relationships with other people. So that might be a relevant issue if this card comes up reversed. Very appropriate to have Bran on there. Bran Stark. Now in card 10, the Wheel of Fortune. This is that wheel, that cog, or wagon wheel, that goes around and around and around. And on each spoke of the wheel, there's a different family crest. And I believe Daenerys talks about this particular concept in one of her sort of monologues at the end of one of the episodes. And she talks about how the wheel just keeps going and going, and whenever it lands over top of one of those spokes, it sort of sits there and crushes it for a moment and then just continues going. And it's sort of a balancing act between all of these different spokes of the wheel, and that's very much what this card is about. This is a card of chance and good luck, but it is also a card of cycles and moving through sort of balanced parts of life evenly, moving through seasons or moving through phases of life, progressing with life, moving through different phases of education. Maybe this can represent those things. Now on the flip side, when it's reversed, of course, and we know that there is sort of a disproportionate amount of power maybe given to one spoke, as happens in the Game of Thrones show and books, of course. It can also indicate bad luck or a complete lack of luck. It can indicate breaking a cycle, which can be good or bad. Just because a card is reversed doesn't mean that it is a bad thing. It just means that the meaning of the card can often be flipped on its head, and we can be talking about an extreme to one side or the other of the meaning of that card. So this can be talking about bad luck, like I said, but it can also talk about breaking cycles, which isn't always a bad thing. Perfect picture for this card. Justice. The Justice card. This is Ned Stark sitting on the Iron Throne, and over top of him is a pair of scales here at the top. And so here, he is wearing the Hand of the King brooch, but I believe he was taking over for King Robert Baratheon. The Justice card can be very similar to the Hierophant, the card that saw Varys on the front as well. We're talking about fairness, moving forward, dividing equally, thinking about all aspects of the equation. Justice, the card, can literally speak of justice and balance and equality and thinking things through and taking a look at both sides of the argument, evaluating all possible options. That's very much the meaning of the Justice card. When reversed, we might start to see signs of dishonesty. We might start to see signs of favoring one side or the other, or not taking the time or the effort to consider other sides of arguments or courses of action. And interestingly enough, the scales here, I just noticed this, the scales have the sigil there of the Faith of the Seven, indicating that oftentimes there can be spiritual reasons that we choose to judge or not judge as well. So that particular piece of the puzzle can sometimes be added to a reading as well. These are the little things that you can infer from the artwork on a set of cards, and that is why I was so pleased with this deck. Now, our next card is a very not controversial card, but maybe a little bit misunderstood. This is not a traditional image usually sort of found on this card, the Hanged Man. Usually it is a fellow in full consciousness who just seems to be gently hanging from one foot upside down from a tree, often by a rope, and he doesn't seem to be minding it a whole lot. He's just kind of, got one leg tucked behind the other, and he's just hanging there thinking, and that's very much what that card represents. Thinking, pausing, letting go and allowing space for new ideas. It's very much a card of creativity. And I prefer to actually think of the Hanged Man instead of a flayed individual. I prefer to think of the image of Odin hanging from the Tree of Life, Yggdrasil, where he hangs waiting to receive the knowledge of the runes. So he waits to receive wisdom, and he hangs there patiently waiting and waiting to receive knowledge, and that's more what this card is about. So, as easy as it is to interpret this card as something kind of gruesome, it's not really. This is very much a card of creativity and pausing and thinking and taking the time to make a decision. So think about pausing time. That's what this card is about. And so if it's upside down, maybe we see some indecision or some rash decision making, not taking the time to think things through. Those are some topics that might come up, some themes that might come up in a reading if this card ends up reversed. This might be my favorite card yet. Still in the major arcana, this is the Death card. Now this card, if you recall the story that I told when we first came into the video, and I was talking about a movie called The Red Violin, and one of the tarot cards that the old Roma woman pulled for Anna, one of the characters, was the Death card. And in that movie, that Death card had a very significant role to play, and I do recommend you check out that movie if you can. Samuel L. Jackson's in it. It's pretty good. Anyway, this is the Death card, and they have chosen Arya Stark to be on the front. And so the image of Arya on this particular card is at the point in the timeline of the series where she is studying to be a faceless man under the tutelage of Jaqen H'ghar, one of my favorite characters. And she is pointing Needle, her little sword, at his throat, as I recall, after she has killed the waif. I think her name was the other faceless man that was a woman, or something like that. The Death card doesn't always represent death, per se. Sometimes it represents ending, the end of something and the beginning of something else. Sometimes it represents transformation or just a big change. So it doesn't always translate literally into death. So it's not always a bad thing. Change can be a good thing. Transformation and moving on can be good things. But when we find this card reversed, we start to notice some of Arya's personal characteristics come into play. We're talking about haste. We're talking about change only for the advantage of the self. So in this case, she had that list of people that she wanted to off, and she would go out of her way and leave the mission and the purpose of the mission to complete those goals based on what she thought was right. Which again is not necessarily a bad thing, but if this card comes up reversed, it might be an opportunity for you to think about what your motives really are for a situation in your life and how you may be approaching that situation and whether or not you may be resistant to changing because you feel like it may not be advantageous for you. So those are some things to look at. I think this is one of my favorite moments in the series, when she pointed needle at Jock and Hagar and said, "You sent her to kill me." And that entire sort of emotional conflict that developed. I loved it. I loved the dedication that we saw move into Arya's eyes, and the purpose, the new sense of purpose that she moved into. This is a perfect card to represent that. Now our next card is the Temperance card, which happens to be one of my favorites. And in the Game of Thrones tarot, they've chosen an image of Samwell Tarly studying to be a maester in the Citadel. And he's patiently reading. It appears, it's hard to tell from the picture, but I think he's studying about dragon glass. And he's kind of got a calm expression on his face here. And that's very much what this card is about. Patience, a sense of purpose and dedication and balance. That's kind of what this card is about. And I think Samwell Tarly and his persistence to go to the Citadel and learn to be a maester so that he can help other people, so that he can help Jon Snow and Jon Snow's purpose. That very much represents the Temperance card. Now, a reversal of this card would represent an imbalance of some sort, maybe acting out of haste or not having a sense of purpose. That might be what this card might mean reversed. But I think this is fantastic. Samwell Tarly just sitting there studying by candlelight in that old library in the Citadel. It's fantastic. Ooh. The Devil. Now, in the traditional tarot illustrations, most decks have the Devil card portrayed by a Baphomet or a goat of Mendes. In this deck, they've chosen Ramsay Bolton, which is a very good character to choose for this purpose, I think. And it appears that he's surrounded with fire and chains. I don't know why, except that he does die in a fire. Spoiler alert. And I don't know if the chains were maybe used to lash prisoners down as they were flayed. I'm not sure. But Ramsay is the embodiment of the Devil card. Ramsay is filled with obsession and attachment, which are some things that we see come up when we turn over the Devil card during a reading. Vices, addictions, and obsessions, and service of self, and oftentimes we also see very excessive sexuality. I suppose we could say self-serving sexuality. So you can see his blue eyes staring at you, and he's kind of smirking. You know, he's very, very aware of what he's doing. He just doesn't care. And that is the Devil card. That is the absolute embodiment of the Devil card, is that sort of sociopathic tendencies, the obsessive risk-taking, not considering other people, very selfish, and taking some of these habits to the extreme. Now in reverse, we might see looking at your shadow self, or the darker side of yourself, and evaluating it, and getting to know it, and understanding the motives behind those things. And that can be very helpful during a reading, to turn up this card and realize that there are some benefits to the shadow side of yourself. It's not always a bad, dark thing, but sometimes it can be frightening and misunderstood. Now, Here is an interesting card, the Tower. And now thinking back to season 1 of Game of Thrones, you can see here is the baby direwolf sitting at the bottom of the tower. This is the tower that Bran Stark climbed and ended up accidentally spying on Cersei and Jaime Lannister. So it does represent a certain amount of innocence, but it also represents change, drastic, sudden change. So this is a very good image to represent that, and especially with the little direwolf sitting down at the bottom, not really being able to do a whole lot and just sitting back and watching as the events unfold. We see some chaos, maybe an absolute mess of things coming, or feeling like you might be in a mess of things. And again, transformation and change and chaos aren't always a bad thing. Now when reversed, this card appears upside down during a reading. We might look at maybe being resistant to change, not wanting to transform or move forward or enhance a particular situation, or we might talk about self-enhancement and improving oneself and being resistant to that, stagnation. Those are some things that might come up in a reading with this card being reversed. I think the direwolf is really cute. Now, another card that very accurately represents its original archetype is the Star. This is another one of the cards that we saw displayed on the box that the deck came in. And this is an image of Sansa Stark looking out the window of the tower on the Bolton estate, where she had lit a candle to indicate that she needed assistance. And so this is very much a card of hope and of faith. Sometimes blind faith, but faith nonetheless. It tends to be a very positive card. It can indicate that one wants to move forward but doesn't necessarily know how. And it's kind of relying on a leap of faith or a blind move forward to move, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. It might mean that that person should maybe look at doing a little bit of research or educating themselves in the situation a little bit more. But I think this image is very accurate to what they were trying to portray. A moment of hope, hoping that Brienne would see the candle and come to her aid. Now reversed, this card can indicate a loss of hope or a lack of hope, and it can also indicate despair, not willing to move forward, or not believing that it's possible to move forward. Those are some of the things that might come up if this card ends up being reversed during a reading. But I think this is a lovely image. I mean, it's not lovely in the sense that it's visually appealing, but it's very accurate to the meaning of the cards, and it's obviously very blue and very dark and very cold. The image is very cold. There's blues and grays, and it shows that it may seem as though there's no way forward, but there can always be hope, even in the most bleakest, coldest of circumstances. That's what this card is about. So our next card is the Moon. Now, I couldn't figure out what this image actually was. I stared at it, and I could not figure out what it was. So I went to the guidebook, and then I realized that it is the moon door at the Eyrie. So this is the little door that opens up in the floor of the Eyrie Castle, where prisoners or people that they don't want hanging around anymore, they'll just kind of throw them out and it's a long way down. And so here we see the moon door is partially open, and it is allowing in some of the light of the moon here in the center. So we usually kind of associate the moon with having a sort of feminine energy, motherly, feminine, nurturing energy. The moon card is not quite that simple. The moon card can often represent fear or anxiety. It's not quite as nurturing as maybe we would like to think that this particular moon energy would be. And so the image of the moon door at the Eyrie, now that I've had the chance to think about it, is quite appropriate. This is something that people would have feared if you thought maybe you might be thrown through it. There's a great deal of uncertainty. How fast will you hit the ground? How hard will you hit the ground? Will your skull explode all over the grassy knolls quickly, or will you lay there and suffer? There's a lot of uncertainty in those questions. But this is also very much a card of illusion. Just because you are standing before the moon door does not mean you are going to fall or be thrown. What it does mean is that you have a chance to look into the abyss and see if you become aware of any facts or knowledge that you weren't aware of before. So we might even extrapolate into talking about subconscious desires or subconscious motivation into a part of your life. Those are some things that we might think about when we look at the moon card, if it comes up during a reading. So it isn't always about fear. It isn't always a bad thing. But if this card ends up reversed, it can have a number of different meanings. And everybody sort of, like I said, reads cards a little bit differently. I often see a reversed moon card as a sort of confusion or uncertainty or unknown. That is the moon. Now the opposite of the moon, you could say, is the sun. And that is the next card in the Major Arcana. This is an interesting little card. This is one of Daenerys' baby dragons. And then in the middle top of the card is the image of the sun. So this is a very positive card. It does not radiate any sort of fear the way that the moon does. Rather, this is a card of sort of success and energy and motivation and a certain amount of affection or warmth. That's often what we find in the sun card. And very appropriately, they've put a baby dragon on this card. And this card can often indicate inner child, and that can be either upright or if the card is reversed. And in this case, that inner child might mean that the person that we're doing a reading for, the person in question, might not have developed a sense of maturity about the situation, or they might be afraid to make decisions and prefer instead to kind of bask in a false optimism, a kind of, oh well, sort of attitude. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, just something worth thinking about. And so that is what the sun card brings us, a sense of warmth and a sense of play. I like this card. Judgment. The Night King. And what I think is his army. What a aggressive looking individual. Again, a very appropriate image. This card does represent its keyword to a certain extent. This card does often represent judgment in the sense of balance and looking at both sides evenly, but it can also represent absolute decisions. For example, the Night King has absolutely decided to take over the Seven Kingdoms with his army of the undead. He has absolutely decided that. There is no question. So that sense of absolution is another keyword that we might find that relates to the Judgment card. It's a very slow-moving but progressive card. But when reversed, we're looking at issues of indecision, the inability to make a choice, or the inability to evaluate a potential course of action, weighing the pros and cons of a potential direction or course of action. Those are a few of the things that might come up in a reading where this card is flipped. It's very interesting. The artwork is cold. It's blue and it's snowy. And I think it also very much represents the energy of the series moving into season 9, which I am so excited for. I am so excited. And so now, the last card of the Major Arcana that sort of represents our journey from the Fool, card 0, all the way up through our last card, which was Judgment. And then now the last card is the World. And you can sort of think of the Major Arcana as being a sort of cycle or a progression through these archetypes. And you can see the archetypes mature as we move through them. So the World very much represents completion and oneness and unity, generally. And you can kind of see it here where there are 4 different sigils, 4 different houses, looking in onto the earth, and it seems to be very peaceful and very complete. And there isn't one particular sigil that is moved further into the frame than the others. They're all very equal. It kind of indicates a balance of power. So that is kind of a first interpretation of the World. This card can also represent travel, not only in a physical sense of visiting different places, but can also indicate kind of a progression throughout different milestones. So if you're following any sort of goal, any sort of path to a particular goal, it can also represent traveling along those different waypoints until you reach your goal. Now, upside down, it can kind of indicate the use of shortcuts, which again isn't always a bad thing, but it can represent that maybe the shortcut wasn't well thought out, or maybe you thought it was a shortcut, but it didn't lead you to where you thought it would go. So there is not that same sense of unity and completeness that we would see with an upright card. So that is the World card, and that is the last card of the Major Arcana. Now, I'm not going to go through the Minor Arcana with you, the 4 houses. However, I'll just draw a couple out and show you some of my favorite pieces of the artwork that are found within those 4 suits of swords, spears, cups, and coins. So we have here the Knight of Spears that is represented by Jaime Lannister, riding probably into battle or onto some sort of task on his horse, so he's ready for battle. It's hard to tell. I don't remember which hand he had amputated, so it's hard to tell if that has happened yet in the storyline. But this does represent a certain amount of courage, determination, even though you know that some of the things in life are difficult, but you're willing to kind of surmount any obstacles that might show up. Now, reversed though, this card can represent a lack of forethought, or haste, or not truly believing in a cause, which I think kind of all describe Jaime Lannister. Following through with a mission, regardless of how much you may believe in that mission, that is what we find in the Knight of Spears, or Wands, for those of you familiar with the traditional suits of tarot. Now, the 5 of Cups is another one of my favorites that I've pulled from the Minor Arcana. And this is an image of Cersei Lannister with her head down. And the cups tend to be a very emotional suit. They correspond to the element of water, and so they're very much about emotion and feeling. And the image on this card makes the meaning of it very apparent. This is, of course, Cersei, obviously very disappointed, has experienced a great deal of loss, but is unable to come to terms with that. This is a card of disappointment. It is a card of hurt and of frustration. And it often represents being stuck and stagnant and unable to move on from an important point and not growing and thinking too much with your heart as it was in the past and not thinking about the future. That is very much what this card is about. And I really like how they've placed 3 spilled glasses of wine and then 2 full ones here. And I like to picture this as her drinking a sip or 2 or 3 from each wine glass and then throwing it on the floor in anger and frustration. She's lost all of her children and she's very, very, very upset. And that is the 5 of Cups. And now the 2 of Swords. The 2 of Swords traditionally represents a very tough decision, having to choose between 2 drastically different outcomes or 2 drastically different processes or progressions. And so on this card we have what appears to be a blind Arya Stark, and she is in the sort of very basic clothing that one would dress in if you were training at the House of Black and White. And so she is obviously still a student of Jaqen H'ghar and the House of Black and White. And here she has Needle, her personal sword, and she also has a wooden sword. And so I think one can extrapolate from this that she's making the difficult decision of moving forward with her training, which would be the wooden sword, or choosing to follow her very strong desire to go her own way and finish taking the lives of the people that are on her list. And so that's a very difficult decision for her. And it looks as though she's kind of exhausted and she's going, what do I do? So, very appropriate, I thought. And the last card I will show you from the Minor Arcana is the Queen of Coins. And of course this is Olenna Tyrell, Lady Olenna. This is a lovely, lovely image. The Queen of Coins is very much about material needs being met in a motherly, nurturing way. So the Queen of Coins represents someone who takes very good care of their family or the people around them and knows how to care for their material needs, that is food, water, shelter, is probably very good at budgeting or keeping track of money. And I think Olenna Tyrell represents that very, very well. She's very good at kind of keeping track of what's going on in her house and amongst her family members. And yet, we also see from the Queen of Coins a sense of independence, stubborn independence. And that can be either in an upright position or in a reversed position. We might find that particular interpretation. So I thought this would be an excellent, excellent card to end on. I believe it is the only image of Olenna Tyrell in the deck, which is disappointing. I think there are several other cards that she could represent very well and be the face of. However, I was very pleased to see this one. So look at her gaze. She's looking forward. She's very, very stubborn and very optimistic and confident. I think it's fantastic. She's such a cute old lady. So that was a look at the Game of Thrones tarot deck and guidebook. I do wish that they had included an image of Joffrey Baratheon in the deck. The inclusions of the other characters and their different points and progressions throughout the series did make sense, but I do think that an image of Joffrey somewhere in the deck would have made this a little bit more complete and would have made it just kind of one step better for those of us who are truly fans of the series and of the storyline, regardless of whether you've been following along in the books or just watching the show or doing both. I did notice that that was kind of an interesting thing to leave out. I don't think there was a single image of Joffrey Baratheon in there. So there are so many characters in the series that it would be difficult to include them all, but I did feel like he was kind of a pivotal character and maybe should have been given a card. I'm sure they could have found one that represented him at a particular point. So that would be my only suggestion, my only criticism, I suppose, of the deck. But otherwise, I really, really enjoyed the artwork and the interpretation and the amount of hard work that went into this deck. And I look forward to using it. So I do hope you enjoyed the video and the imagery that was on these wonderful, beautiful cards. Thank you very, very much for joining me. If you're headed off to bed, I do hope that you have the most wonderful dreams in the world and that you will wake up refreshed and renewed and in the best mood ever. So, with that said, I will see you next time.